All right, so we're moving on with the final unit, Unit 4. And in this chapter, we're discussing the LLC um, and a few other special forms of businesses. But the focus of this chapter is, of course, the limited liability company. All right. Okay, so when we're talking about the LLC, um, we're really talking about the new kid on the block, so to speak, as it relates to forms of business, right? And they're around 30 or 40 years old, which doesn't sound young by any stretch. But when we compare to other entities that have been well established for, in most cases, a century or more, that should give you some perspective, all right? And it's the most flexible entity that exists, right? Because if I start a sole proprietorship, chances are the LLC is accessible to me. I can generally afford that because they're typically not that expensive to start up. Alternatively, some of your largest LLCs rival the size and scope operationally of mega corporations, which we'll get to in the chapters to come. So that said, it is the most flexible choice of entity that exists, and when faced with the choice of entity, there's a good chance that the best choice is often an LLC. All right, and the reason for that is it offers limited liability for the owner, and also for multiple member LLCs. Now, in an LLC, member is just the term we use for owner. And so when you have multiple owners, you can elect pass-through taxation, and they're taxed like a partnership. All right. And so when we talk about the law governing LLCs, this is the biggest downfall, is that it's not consistent from state to state. There is a Uniform LLC Act, but it is not as widely accepted as other uniform laws that we've discussed, like the Uniform Partnership Act or the Uniform Commercial Code. All right, it's more like uniform or the Model Corporations Code, which we haven't discussed yet, but will be referenced in future chapters. And neither of them, the Model Corporation Code or the Uniform Limited Liability Company Act, is widely accepted. In fact, they're really kind of looked to for inspiration as it relates to certain aspects of state law, but most states draft their own law, so there are going to be some differences. And so the treatment of an LLC in Ohio is going to be different from Kentucky, which is going to be different from Indiana. All right, so that is the biggest drawback of the LLC. There's a lack of uniformity. And the main reason being is because many states feel that they already have laws that govern the substance of an LLC. For instance, if I start a sole proprietorship and I take the extra step of forming an LLC, it may cost me a couple $100 or sometimes even less, depending upon the state, to do that. But substance over form, the only difference between that and me being a sole proprietor is the fact that I have to observe the formalities of operating as an LLC, and then I have limited liability. So other legal things, I can be treated like a sole proprietor because substance over form, that's what it is. The same for two or multiple members, two or more multi-member LLCs that have two or more owners. Well, states already have partnership law that's applicable and would be applied in those cases. The mere fact that you call the owners members as opposed to partners doesn't really make a difference, and so partnership law would be applicable in those cases. So that's the reason that we don't have a uniform LLC law. Let's press on. All right. So conceptually, the best bet is to think of the LLC as like an umbrella or a shed that you can place business assets and liabilities under, and doing so kind of shields from liability, right? And that's really what the LLC is, because I can take two identical businesses operationally. One has taken the additional step of forming the LLC and the other is not. Well, one would be a general partnership and the other is an LLC. So one, the members have limited personal liability, and the other they don't. All right. I've already addressed this point, members, but be familiar with the members. The owners are called members, and we don't use the word owner or partner. We use the word member. You can have a single member or a multi-member LLC. All right. The biggest benefit: limited personal liability, limited to what you've invested in the company, and that assumes that you've properly absorbed. I keep saying observed the formality necessary to maintain that limitation in liability. Right, and we'll talk about what that is, and there's some similarities with this and also limited liability as it relates to the corporate form that we'll discuss. You may remember entity theory from your partnership chapter. Well, that's applicable here as well. LLCs are a legal entity separate from their owner, even if it's a single member or a multi-member LLC, and that unit, that entity, will absorb lawsuit. All right, it is set up to sue and be sued. All right. So speaking about that liability, how does an owner or a member of an LLC ensure that they are not personally liable for the obligations of the LLC? Well, it depends upon the type of obligation, because as a single member LLC, you're not going to have any more access to capital than a sole proprietor, because substance over form, that's what you are. All right. So the only way to get a loan or to get certain contracts is with a personal guarantee. All right. So that commonly does happen with single member LLCs. They have to personally guarantee with their own credit, loans, and certain contracts for business purposes. All right. Beyond that, from an operational sense, to how to avoid the negligence lawsuit, or liability from the negligence lawsuit, I should say. Commingling of funds. What does this mean? You have an LLC account. Members have a personal account. Business expenses and revenues go into the business account. Personal expenses go into the personal account. And keeping those separate. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take owner withdrawals, since oftentimes that's how owners sustain themselves. But that will be the only time that funds cross from the business account into the personal account. Flagrant disregard of LLC formalities, and this really varies from state to state, because some states have relatively minimal requirements for the LLC as an entity, and others may require annual filings and certain things be kept up to date with the Secretary of State. So it's going to vary from state to state, but there are rules that govern what LLCs must do, and as a small business owner, you have to stay in conformity with those if you hope to have limited personal liability.